Okay. Hey guys, welcome. Today I'm going to be presenting on the approaches in periodization for single competition sport versus multiple competition sport. We're just trying to look at the differences in how we would go about structuring the program for athletes competing in a sport which requires one main competition a year versus athletes who are required to compete in 3 to 4 competitions a year. Okay, before we get started off, the base fundamental of any periodized program is to identify the traits of the athlete which needs to be developed before we can put a set structure on it. And from that, I've been able to highlight 8 biomotor abilities which are critical in when it comes to actually programming and periodizing a set structure for a given time frame. The abilities identified are strength, power, endurance, speed, coordination, change of direction, agility, flexibility, and mobility and balance. Now, I'll be giving a very brief introduction to all of these. So, strength would basically its ability to move, ability to exert maximum amount of, say, for example, perform a task without respect to time. Strength does not take into respect the time. So you have two units there, which is absolute as well as relative strength. Absolute is the ability to push against an external load, whereas relative would be a relative load with respect to your body weight. Power is nothing but strength, which takes into account the element of time. You have your starting and your reactive power, starting with, say, give an example of starting off from the blocks for a sprinter, whereas reactive would be your ability to switch from the eccentric muscle contraction to the concentric muscle contraction, say, in the case of a squat where you're going down and you come back up. So the reactive time which you spend within the transition of these two phases. Endurance could be categorized as the ability to express strength or speed over a larger period of time. So it is not restricted to a short period of time, but it's on a longer period of time. Speed could be categorized into acceleration, deceleration, and max velocity, max speed running. Coordination, you would have both intramuscular and intermuscular. This plays a huge role when it comes to the single competition as well as multi-competition sport, which I'm going to be addressing in the coming slides. Change of direction would encompass a combination of both acceleration, deceleration, and coordination, whereas agility is a little bit more demanding when it comes to using an external source to react to, whereas change of direction would have more of a scripted sequence. Agility would involve one reacting to an external stimulus, say, for example, reacting to the placement of a shot in a badminton game. Flexibility, mobility is a huge fundamental aspect because in this you have three categories: active, passive, and dynamic. Now, one must possess enough active range of motion over the passive as well as the dynamic range of motion. This is critical primarily from the fact that if one does not possess active range of motion, then there is a higher chance of being pushed dynamically, especially when it comes to any physical contact game or any game which requires you to move quickly from one position to other. You are forced to get into positions using momentum which might lead to a potential injury. So it is very critical for athletes to have active flexibility and mobility and not just passive or dynamic. And balance plays a critical role when it comes to any sport. So you have a righting reflex, which is primarily encompassed when an athlete is standing on a stable surface. For example, in the game of soccer, where somebody's standing and now the body shifts, you move from one point to the other. So the shift in balance is what is called a righting reflex, where the ground is a stable surface on which you're standing on. Tilting reflex is going to be the opposite, where you're standing on more of a unstable surface. For example, a surfer, where you're cruising on a wave, but it is an unstable surface where you're forced to maintain your balance before you're able to move on. So these are the primary abilities or the biomotor abilities of athletes which need to be considered before setting about a program for their particular sport and competition. Now, coming down to the actual details of periodization, why periodize? It's basically nothing but a structure set in place to stimulate specific physiological and performance outcomes at appropriate times. So you always work with a backward goal. In a sense, you have a fixed competition, you have a schedule, and you prepare in advance for that schedule. So it's just a matter of planning. So you have a particular outcome. Say, for example, you want to compete in by the end of the year. So you prepare up until the point where you're able to compete. and give it your best against the competition. Now, why periodize? What is the importance of it? As mentioned earlier, it helps optimize performance at set points of a competitive calendar. So you want to peak at a particular competition, you can use this periodized structure to peak at a particular competition by tuning the different variables in it. It also helps maximizing the physiological adaptations because you're following a structured approach. You want to elicit certain changes when it comes to your body composition or your neuromuscular coordination, neuromuscular strength as well. So it plays a huge role in structuring one's program so that you get the best physiological outcomes for the particular set competition. And most importantly, periodization is important to ensure and manage primarily the undertraining and overtraining of an athlete. As much as people might put a lot of emphasis on preventing overtraining of athletes, making sure that someone is not undertrained is critically important as well, because as much as you wouldn't want somebody entering a competition at a highly fatigued state, you also don't want somebody coming to the competition ill prepared. You want to see an optimal training status when you come to a competition, so you can perform at the highest rate possible. Now, there are certain points of concerns when it comes to periodization. So the earlier model, so you have your older models and you have your modern models of periodization, whereas most of them tend to have one, they tend to go between two sides of the spectrum. One side being that there's not enough variation in the training, whereas the other side says there's too much variation in it. So when there's not enough variations, obviously you're only limited to two other training components, which are your volume as well as intensity. Now, doing the repeated same action over a long period of time can lead to boredom of the athlete training. It could lead to decreased motivation, or it could elicit poor adaptations as well, because research shows that any set modalities used for a slightly longer period of time can start to slow down adaptations. So you need to consider changing it up to ensure that you are optimally adapting for the particular preparation. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you also have too much variation where it's randomized at the end of the day. So it can be excessive and randomly applied. So you have an athlete doing a huge variety of training, using a huge variety of training modalities. And this again can be counterproductive to the goal you want to see towards the end, because it also is poor in a sense of maximizing one's physiological adaptations. There's not enough consistent stress to see certain adaptations come off from it. Now, on the right side, you see that you see the residual duration. So this was highlighted by Esur and Elastic. So they speak about the different motor abilities and their residual duration. Now, if you look at the top two, which has your aerobic endurance as well as your maximal strength, these are certain motor abilities which take a longer duration of time before showing some signs of detraining. So these two could anywhere vary between 25 to 35 days, whereas you have certain traits which do go off a little faster, such as your strength endurance and your maximal speed, which could again anywhere vary between 10 to 20 days and 2 to 8 days respectively. So a periodized plan should always take into consideration these motor abilities as well, and ensure that an athlete is preparing is always topping up each of these abilities, specifically with respect to their competition, to ensure that they are at the best physically prepared state at the end of the day. Now, coming to modifiable variables, obviously a periodized plan has different modalities, and there are different variables which could be modified to get different adaptations at the end of the day. You have your choice, which is basically the choice of exercises you could administer. So you have a huge variety to work from. So it's good to have an end goal in play before you actually choose the exercise, because it helps you follow a set structure. Then you have your order of exercises, which again would prior in the training. So are you working towards a particular goal of strength or power or muscle endurance? So you could order the exercises to elicit these individual adaptations and to get the best bang for buck as well. And the frequency comes down to how many times in a week are you training these particular traits. Are you doing it once a week? Are you doing it twice a week? And so on and so forth. Progression is a huge key in this as well, because an athlete can progress through many means. The most common means of progression is seen through increasing the weight lifted as well at the end of the day. So you want to see an athlete lift, say in the case of a single competitive event such as Olympic weightlifting, you have a set goal to reach of a set weight you want to lift at competition. So when you're building up to that particular instance, you want to ensure that you are progressing through the weight so that you're able to actually be in competitive shape when it actually matters. Intensity, volume, and rest. So these three kind of pretty much go together. So the higher the intensity, the lower the volume you would administer in a training session. So intensity could be, I am doing at a 90% of my max effort or a 70% of my max effort. It could really depend on how much your ceiling is and to what extent of your ceiling you are actually pushing through each session. Volume shares an inverse relationship with intensity. You can't have an extremely intense session with high volume as well. So that just calls for a lot of trouble at the end of the day, especially when you're preparing athlete for a long-term goal. So it's a matter of finding the right fine-tuning between intensity and volume at the end of the day. And for your rest is pretty much how much rest is an individual taking between the sets, and it could also encompass certain other variables such as recovery from the training session or using certain recovery means to get the best benefit before the competition or within the competition as well, which I will be walking through in the coming slides. Now, the Canadian Weightlifting Association has broadly categorized athletes into three categories. So you have your learn to train athletes, who are primarily the younger ones who are starting to learn a sport. So they would be in their early years where they pick up certain skills and they learn to develop certain skills. They play to learn the sport. Then you have your intermediate athletes who primarily train to train, they train to better themselves, or they even train to compete. So they would be competing at a local meet or even like a state level meet, and they just want to improve their numbers in the case of powerlifting at the end of the day. Or you could say, as in recreational athlete who is also looking to win a few games every now and then when he plays competitively at a local level or a club level. Then you have the important category, which is you learn to win and you're trained to win. So these are your professional athletes whose main objective is to win. So whether it's going out at a national competition and securing the gold medal, or it's participating in a world championship or an Olympic championship and getting a gold medal. So this is the eventual goal of athletes who fall within the category of learn to win or train to win. Now, for this presentation, we're going to be primarily focusing on athletes who fit into the third category of learn to win and train to win. Now, coming down to the actual matter, which is differentiating between the single competitive sport whereas a multi-competition sport. We're going to take a look at the single competition sport to start with. And for this presentation, the example I have gone with is the case of Olympic weightlifting. Now, as mentioned earlier, periodization is all about planning. So you always start with the end goal in mind. Say, for example, a national championship or a world championship. So you start with that particular goal in mind, and you divide your annual cycle into the different stages of training or blocks, whichever approach you want to use. So you always divide it and you work with an end goal in mind. And a common way of actually training for the case of Olympic weightlifting is the concept of block periodization, which encompasses three things, which is primarily accumulation, transmutation, and realization. Now, this is just an example of how a training cycle would look like for a weightlifter whose end objective is to actually compete in the world championship. So say, for example, you see September week 1, week number 36. So that could be the end competition where you want your athlete to be at his absolute best. And you have the 28th week in July where, say, an athlete is competing at a national level where he still wants to improve. He's still improving. He's not hit his absolute potential. And you have the 20th week, which is in May, when an athlete is competing at a slightly lower level tournament. So he's just getting into the groove of actually figuring out how the skill works, how the structure works, and improving himself to eventually peak and perform his best in that world championship, which is in the first week of September. This chart could be a little misleading, as much as some people would like to believe that the training cycle starts in the first week of the year, which is in January. You would have the cycle start after the competition has gotten over, because you are an athlete competing primarily at that stage. Once you finish competing, say in the month of September, you'd probably take some time off and then you would get back to your training. So the ideal training cycle would start late September or early October. And if you look at the graph down, it gives you an idea of how the volume and the intensity kind of play with each other, and how each of these variables is modified depending on the time of the year, or depending on the block of the year which you fall in, depending on the competition too. You can see that the intensity is highlighted in the orange. So from the month of October, it pretty much kind of flatlines until the month of mid-March, where it picks up, because I'll come to this a little bit in detail in the next slide, but it's primarily just to encompass how one's progressing when it comes to using the blocks of accumulation, transmutation, and periodization. So I'm going to be going a little back and forth between the previous slide and this one, just to give you an understanding of how it works in a real setting of a structure of a calendar. So if you look at the accumulation phase, this would ideally start once you're done with your competition in September. So when you get back to training in October. So in accumulation phase is primarily going to consist of a lot of volume. So it pretty much would go on until the month of March, because say you are competing in just one event in a year, you have a lot of time to build the base structure of your pyramid, which is your general prep. So you have a lot of time to build your general prep, get really strong, get all your adaptations is required, and then you can progress on from there on. So an accumulation phase is primarily going to have a lot of volume. The intensity is going to be quite low because these are variables which are inversely related. You can't have a high of both and still continue to train at a very high level. So there is a cost for keeping both of them high as well. So in this case, we're gonna be training the athlete with a very high level of volume while keeping the intensity slightly less. And this phase is used to build on the primary motor abilities. So you would use this as the building block to build the athlete up, and then have a strong base within which you're going to transform it into the transmutation stage. You improve the physiological responses here. In this case, it could be highlighted as, say, hypertrophy or volume. So you build, you build, you build. Now, the effect of building an athlete through, say, a six month long period, you are going to be adding a lot of volume into the training. There is going to be a lot of hypertrophic elements and your basic strength elements as well. So this is going to elicit certain changes when it comes to one's physiology, including having the athlete put on some weight, which is also dictated here. So say you would start off at a competitive weight class of 70, 77, and as you progress through your blocks, you might slowly start increasing your weight at a small pace, say 0.3 kilos a week. You'll start increasing slowly until you get to a point where you need to get to the transmutation stage, where you start dropping and get ready for the competition stage. So you would have an athlete slowly increase the body mass through the accumulation stage as well. And this is, as highlighted, the longest phase of training. It's broken down into smaller bits to improve the adaptive response. As mentioned earlier, you always want to have some different stimulus come in at every. You don't want to keep the same stimulus for a long period of time, because it is going to have a significant drop off at the end of the day, and you want the athlete to get the best out of the training so you can have the best adaptive response and the best performance at the end of the day. Now, once you're done with the build phase of it, we can actually move on to the transmutation stage or the transformation stage. So in this case, we would somewhere start around the end of March, where towards the end of the first transmutation, so the transmutation would be a mesocycle. So along that, the second microcycle, as you can see in block 1 and block 2, would fall under general strength. So you want to start getting the athlete ready to compete at a high level. So say in this case, second week of May would primarily have an athlete get ready for a local meet or even say a state level meet. Now you want the athlete to actually transform the qualities built in the accumulated phase and get it into more specific training in the transmutation phase. So it's nothing but transforming these set qualities. And you also want to start including a lot more specific motor and technical training, because at the end of the day, Olympic weightlifting is not just about squatting or deadlifting or pushing. You have more technical elements which require a lot of coordination, such as your clean and jerk as well as your snatch. So these are highly technical movements. So you want to incorporate a lot more into the training to improve the biomechanical efficiency of these movements. And now that you are actually getting close to the competitive phase, you can start tweaking the variables around it, such as your volume and intensity. The volume is going to go down over time, whereas the intensity slightly picks up, because towards the end of your cycle, when you actually have to compete at your world championship, you want the athlete to be working at 100% capacity. So you need to start slowly building the athlete up to be able to actually perform at 100%. And again, now because you are trading off with high intensity and slightly lesser volume, there is a slight chance for an athlete to be getting into the overworked or the overtrained area. So a lot of restorative means have to be used in this cycle to ensure that the athlete doesn't overtrain at the end of the day and fatigue and is not able to compete or train, because then you lose valuable time in preparation. Again, as highlighted earlier, the certain residual training capacities as well. So you can use these microcycles to kind of touch up these residual things so that the athlete does not lose out on these means. Now, coming on to the actual the realization phase, where, say for example, in this case, you would have an athlete go through the transmutation phase up until he hits, say, block 1 of maximum strength or block 2 of maximum strength. Now, from there, you need to get the athlete to actually start getting to his peak potential, where he's going to have to compete at the world championship. Now, the realization base, the phase, the primary emphasis is directed to attain peak performance. You want to compete the best. You're going to go against the best in the world. So you want the athlete to be at his best shape possible. And the intensity is going to slowly start creeping up towards the actual game day or the event day. So as the intensity creeps up, the volume has to come down as well to maintain that homeostasis in programming. And there's a lot of psychology involved in this process when it comes to event specific readiness. So start training the patterns, start simulating the similar scenarios. And obviously it's a written rule, that's an unwritten rule, that there is a lot of intensity, so there is going to be a lot more fatigue which sets in this phase. So there's a critical reasoning to actually use more restorative means, because at the end of the day, you would want to get the athlete at the best state possible. And in this case, if an example could be, you could super compensate. So you use these restorative means to get the athlete to be in his best shape possible when the competition arises, and when he has to perform the best, so he can push more than 100%. So moving on to the multiple competition sport, I'm going to use the example of badminton here to take this forward on the periodization model. Now, if you look at a yearly competitive structure of badminton, it would primarily have anywhere from 3 to 4 competitions a year. Let's say, for the example, we're going with 4 competitions a year. So you're going to need to have the athlete to peak at 4 different points in time. So you're going to have to get him or her to be ready at 4 different points in time. So the model gets a little bit more complicated in this case, because there is a lot more variables to factor in as well. You have your sport specific training, which is involved here as well. Whereas when it comes to weightlifting, the sport and physical preparedness go together hand in hand. Whereas here you have 2 different variables which need to be tied up together. So it's double the amount of stress in a much lesser time frame. So that is a crucial variable to take into place here as well. So if you look at this, it says macro cycle of 3 months. So it could either be a macro cycle every 3 months, or you can use semantics to even argue that you could have one macro cycle for a year long and break it down into 4 mesocycles. And this table you see here could be a mesocycle. At the end of the day, it depends from individual to individual. It depends on how you plan to look at it. So let's just say this macro cycle is 3 months long. So you're going to have 4 macro cycles in a particular year. So you're going to have the athlete peak at these different points in time. The badminton schedule can be a little bit more complicated when it comes to actually having other competitive phases, like your pre-competitive phase, much similar to the one we saw earlier, where you have your local meet, you have your state level meet, and your national meet. But these are, because you're working with a smaller time window, these tend to be a little bit more clubbed up together than the earlier model you had seen. So say, for example, we're looking at the case of the months of April, May, and June, and you have the athlete getting into the competitive period of 7 weeks, which consists of the ranking tournament, the warm-up tournament, and the major tournament as well. So these are going to go over a period of 7 weeks, whereas you have 6 weeks to prepare. So the model adapted here is primarily based off the Bondarchuk training principles. So I have broken it down into different modes here. So as you can see, week 1 to 3 would primarily consist of the general physical preparation. Weeks 4 to 6 would primarily consist of a special physical preparation, and you have your pre-competitive phase, your main competitive phase, and your peak competitive phase, where you would be facing the final tournament before you rest and repeat this cycle again for, say, another 3 more times in a year. As mentioned, the general physical prep is going to be similar to that you saw of the accumulation phase, but it's going to be significantly smaller, where you have 6 months of that in that example, where you have 3 weeks here. So it is going to encompass many similar components. So it's going to be physically intensive. So there's going to be a little high volume work done in this time frame to get the best benefit, and you're working in a shorter time window as well. So you want to ensure that you maximize the time which you use. And it's going to be high frequency. You're going to be training quite a lot. So there's going to be a lot of fatigue setting in during this 3-week preparation phase. You also have to understand that there is a lot more sports specific skill which is going to be required here, along with the general physical preparation as well. So you're going to have when it comes to physical preparation, an ideal training opportunity would be using long anaerobic work intervals, whereas you push the athlete to develop that strong fundamental base. And now you combine agility along with the strength training elements as well. Now you're trying to get a little bit more sports specific work, but you're not trying to go too deep into that side because it's still in the general physical preparation stage where you're trying to build some base qualities before you actually progress it on to slightly more specific things. And sports specific work is going to be primarily aerobic in nature because you want to build a strong tank at the end of the day, because the aerobic system is going to primarily is going to dictate how well you recover anaerobically. So you want to ensure that you have your aerobic base covered to start with before you start building the other components. And you want to ensure that the emphasis is on patterns and repetition. So you want to ensure that you're trying to get into more specific patterns of play. You're trying to hit a shot at a particular place. You're trying to just practice a sweep, or you're trying to practice a drop shot, etc. Now moving on to the second phase, which is your special physical preparation, which still falls in the first 6-week window of your preparation phase. Now it's going to look a little similar to the transmutation phase you've seen a little earlier. Your frequency is going to come down, your intensity is going to pick up. Now the emphasis here is to actually transform the qualities you built in the earlier general physical preparation phase into more specific ones. So you would work on a little more strength, more power, and speed. So now you want to slowly start getting into more sport specific action. You want to get yourself in the way, say, when it comes to physical prep, you want to put yourself in positions which emulate the sport. The work intervals are going to start becoming a little bit more anaerobic, but not as anaerobic as they were in the general physical preparation phase. So you would have work sets on physical preparation anywhere between 5 to 15 seconds to ensure that you are giving the max power as possible within that work set without actually fatiguing too much by extending the set for a longer period of time. The sport specific work is going to increase in intensity, and the technique is going to get slowly close to game speed because you built the fundamental of technique in the previous phase, and now you're trying to get it into more specifics. You're trying to get it into game specific actions and game specific speed as well. And the speed which you emphasize in physical preparation is going to help nicely tie up the sport specific aspects of it as well. Now, moving on to the competitive phase, it's broken down into 3 sets. So you have your pre-competitive phase, you have your main competitive, as well as your peak competitive phase. Now, most badminton tournaments or badminton or tennis tournaments end up having a ranking tournament which is going to decide your placement in the major tournament. So you do not everybody, people don't give it their 100% here. Yes, ranking is important, but it's also about strategy. You want to place yourself accordingly, so you get the path of least resistance in the major tournament. Again, there's a lot of unpredictability here, which I will touch on in the future slides. So the pre-competitive phase, the more emphasis is given to tactical elements. So you want to get yourself in game-specific positions when it comes to on-court sport-specific work. You want to get yourself into playing those particular things, and you're going to spend less time on technique because technique has been built through the general physical preparation as well as the special physical preparation. So moving on, so this is a short phase. You play the warm-up tournament and you slowly start getting ready to perform at your best. You have your main competitive phase where you have your warm-up tournament before you actually proceed on to the main championships. So here the games are going to slightly start picking up medium to high intensity. People are going to start using a little bit more tactical advantage to understand how people move and how they are moving and make changes accordingly. It's very important to maintain these physical training qualities here because, as mentioned earlier, all the motor abilities have their residual period. So you want to keep topping them off to ensure that you aren't detraining at the end of the day. You aren't detraining the athlete at the end of the day. And higher emphasis here is on recovery because you are slowly getting into the competitive phase. So you want the athlete to actually be as fresh as possible, moving on from main competitive to the peak competitive phase. Now, the peak phase is your main tournament of the 4-month period. Now, you need to go all out here. So this is the highest level of competition one is going to play at. So the emphasis here is to win. So you're not going into the competition to come second or third. You want to win. Now there's going to be little to no physical training in this time frame because all the effort is going to go into actually playing the sport, actually going out there, giving your best effort on the court. If there is some physical training, it's going to be limited to very, very little physical training. And the critical emphasis here is going to be again on recovery modalities, because with each game going all out, it is going to take a toll on the body. It's going to take a toll on the physiology as well as psychology of the body. So it is highly important to use restorative means to ensure that the athlete stays fresh for the competition, and he's actually able to perform in the finals where it's most important. Because you can have an athlete go through the entire process of playing through the group stages, playing through the initial stages and the quarters and the semis, but if he doesn't perform in the finals, that's where it's actually most important. So there's critical emphasis on restorative means to ensure the athlete stays fresh and is able to come out and give his best in that particular game. Now, once this entire cycle is done, there's going to be a small time frame where it's going to be a rest time or it's a transition period before the entire cycle begins again. Now, there could be different modalities used here. It could be used to completely rest up and recover from the fatigue which is built up, or this could also be used to build use low intensity training to build an aerobic base, because an aerobic base is your strongest fundamental base, which is going to help ensure that you are recovering anaerobically fast as well. And this entire process is going to repeat for another 3 cycles of a year. Say they are playing 4 tournaments a year at fixed time points. Now that we've learned these particular concepts of how you would go about programming for an athlete who is in a single competitive sport, whereas multi-competitive sport, it also comes to a point of application. So there are some real world issues and there are some differences between the two, which I'm going to highlight coming up. So the differences in approach, where if you look at from a macro cycle level, as in say for the entire year, if you so you let's say for this example, the athlete's training program is a macro cycle for badminton, under which there are 4 mesocycles, each of which you need to peak at. So in a single event sport, you would have one main peak. So you're going to peak for your national competition. Whereas in your multiple event, you're going to peak overall. So you're going to peak, say you're going to peak on different points of the year. So you have 4 competitions where you need to be at your best shape possible. Now, obviously, this means it's a shortened training period. So there's a lot more hurry and a lot more emphasis. There's a high risk, high reward scenario here. So it's all about finding the right amount of stress to put on to get the best adaptations. And as mentioned earlier, the single competitive event of weightlifting, your sports specific skill goes pretty much hand in hand with your physical preparation. Your squatting, your pushing, all these movements go hand in hand with the movements which are going to perform at a competition, because they are, I wouldn't say very similar in nature, but they have a lot of similarities. Whereas in your multiple event sports, there is significantly different sports specific skills than what you perform in the weight room. So these have to be factored in as well. And it's critical that you balance out both to ensure that you're not compromising on one while getting maximum adaptations from the other. You want to get the best of both worlds from both the sports specific side and the physical preparation side of things. Now, at a mesocycle level, again, so the single event has one peak. So you would peak just before the main competition. Whereas here you would peak at every mesocycle. So you want to peak at every competition. The each cycle, other cycles are addressed to training specific, say specific qualities of the athlete. Say in the case of Olympic weightlifting, you are going to use this other mesocycles to actually address the specific requirement of an athlete. Say if he's lagging behind on a set muscle group, which is going to prove detrimental for him performing at a high level. So you'd use it to build volume to improve these things which are falling back. Whereas in your multiple event sports, since these cycles are a lot shorter, you have to consider the residual training effect to a larger degree than you would in the single event sport. You want to address these every now and then to top it off to ensure that the athlete is not detraining in any of the facet which is required for elite performance. Now, the stark difference actually comes when you look at the microcycle level, because at the microcycle level, it's highly dependent on the phase you're at. Again, because of the shortened time window, the multiple event category is going to have a slightly hurried up microcycle as well, because you want to get the most in the least time possible. It's going to follow a similar process of accumulation, transmutation, realization, but on a shorter scale as seen earlier. In the single event sport, a block model could ideally could work really well. So a block model is what I spoke about with the accumulation, transmutation, and realization. This could work very well because you have a lot of time to prepare, and you can actually use this time to actually focus on these elements and build these elements in a slow and controlled manner, because you can actually take the time and you have the liberty to do that. But the daily undulating manner could work as well. Say you could have two categories of athletes. Say you have category one who wants to just focus on peaking at the world championships. You have a second athlete who want to do well in both the state meet as well as the national meet as well as the world championship meet. So a daily undulating model could work great there, because as Cal Dietz speaks of in Triphasic, he says that a daily undulating model could prove benefits to hitting multiple peaks. So you could use that to get illicit changes where one peak is significantly bigger than the other, and you could progress on. So you could have an athlete do really well at a state championship, go out there and absolutely destroy the national championship, and go to the international level and perform at his highest level possible. So a daily undulating model would work great benefits for an athlete who wants to do that. At the end of the day, we compete to win. So that should take primary emphasis. Whereas in your multiple event sport, there is high stress, and it's a high stress, high recovery process, because you are playing the sport as well as training, physically preparing by the side. So it is a lot of stress which goes onto the body. So there's going to be a lot more recovery which is required to elicit better changes to ensure the athlete can compete and is not completely bogged down with fatigue. A daily undulating model would work great here, because it also helps to distribute the workload and train the different facets on a weekly basis in the microcycle stage. You could have an athlete come in one, say for example, as Caldit speaks about, you could have somebody come in on a Monday and get them to do a moderate intensity workload, come on a Wednesday and do a high intensity workload, and come on a Friday and do a high volume workload, and repeat this process in a microcycle level. So you would have somebody who can use each of these adaptations, and you won't have any, so you're not going to have interference when it comes to adaptation. So because you're doing a high volume at the end of the week and you still have 2 days to recover from it, you're not going to be completely destroyed when you come in and try tackling the moderate intensity on Monday. So these are the different approaches which you could use when it comes to a single event sport or a multiple event sport. Now, obviously, as mentioned earlier, we don't live in a perfect world. This would all work great if we live in a perfect world and everything goes as planned. But there are certain factors we have to consider when it comes to training, when it comes to periodizing and planning. So, factor number one is individuality. All of us are different. One might adapt to a particular stress differently than another person would. You can't impose the same demand on the person and expect to see the same amount of adaptation from them. That's going to do more harm than good. So you need to understand the individual component of it. Then you have stress. Stress is holistic at the end of the day. The body does not differentiate stress from, oh, I'm stressed from working out, I'm stressed because I have to prepare for my presentation, oh, I'm stressed because I have an examination coming up. Stress is stress, so it's holistic, it adds up. So this is critical, because you need to consider stress. You can't just say, okay, I'm only giving the person to do so much volume and this is stress from his workout. You need to consider the other factors. The athlete has a life, they have the things which they have the personal life, they have their whatever it is. So these are things which also need to be considered when it comes to managing and periodizing. Uncertainty. Now, you could have an athlete walk in and say he couldn't sleep the night because his kid kept him up. What are you going to do in that? These are factors you just cannot control. And you have to have a procedure in place to ensure that this is taken into consideration when you are planning it. Because if you don't, then you have an athlete come in who's had a horrible night's sleep, and you expect to put them through a particular workout, and they're just not going to be able to go the 100%. Sometimes it's required, yes, but there are going to be times they're not going to do. So what are you going to do in that case? Your periodization model just goes for a toss, and that you don't have that one session, or it could happen multiple times. So there's another factor which we need to really consider before we actually go about programming. And the last one is travel. Most of the sports require people to travel. You're going to go for a world championship, or you're playing multiple badminton tournaments. They're not going to bring the tournament to you. You're going to go to the tournament, the place where it's held, and compete there. So there's also a component of time, jet lag, which you also have to take into account. Traveling westward or eastward is a lot of fatigue at the end of the day. So these are the 4 factors which have to be considered before programming a periodized plan. Now, how do we consider it? So I've highlighted 2 ways in which you could actually focus on factoring in these components of individuality, stress, uncertainty, and travel. The first one being auto-regulation. So now the main reason why auto-regulation is come up in so much in light, and some could argue that it is the future of training, is primarily because it accounts for periods of recovery. So it's not just about what you're doing, it also takes into account, say, training or competition. Because when you are working with an athlete who is playing a sport along with it, there is skill components involved as well. So you are considering these components of, okay, I have a training session which I've come from or I've done yesterday. It was a high intensity training session. So how am I supposed to work out today? I feel extremely fatigued. So auto regulation takes that into account, and also it shows flexibility to account for uncontrollable factors. As mentioned earlier, you have somebody come in after a horrible night's sleep. Now you can auto regulate the training to ensure that he is focusing on certain elements as which is what required for that particular day's training session. And most importantly, it helps us just control what we can control, because you want to ensure that you can't control these four factors. You can't control how an individual responds to stress. You can't control how an individual responds to training. You can't control stress. You definitely can't control uncertainty or travel. But the one thing you can control is the training process. So you have to work with what you can control, which is what auto-regulation speaks highly about. So you can regulate one's training based on an individual state of readiness. And at the end of the day, you have to come in, and every sport is primarily about force production. So it's RFPs, rate of force production. You have, say, for example, force is mass times acceleration. Everybody knows this. So day one you could walk in and you're supposed to hit a particular target. Say, let's just keep it at a particular number X. Now you could work around it two ways. You could increase the weight you lift, or you could increase the velocity of the movement. At the end of the day, it's going to multiply and give you a product which is force. Now, say for example, you come in one day and you're absolutely bogged down from one of the four factors. What are you going to do? Are you going to get the athlete to still lift that particular weight when he or she is clearly not ready to do it? So that's where you introduce a component of velocity to determine the weight lifted, because it's a two-way equation. So you can either change the mass or you could change the acceleration to get the same output at the end of the day. So you could use a velocity to determine the weight lifted to still ensure that you are getting the best benefit of that training session. Another modality which could be used is a drop off. A lot of Soviet scientists used to do this back in the day. So they used to have an athlete come in and do a particular movement, and say in the case of, I'm doing a set of drop jumps from a box and I'm measuring it on a force plate or a mat or a jump mat. I was supposed to do 4 sets of 6. Now I come in, I do 3 sets fine, and the fourth set, the first step itself, I have a huge 10% drop off. And now that's it. So my intention is going out of the window because I am not able to exert myself in the maximal manner which I want to exert. So in that case, what are you going to do? So that's where the drop off auto regulation comes into play. So you set certain targets which you have to meet. And if you're not able to meet that target, or there's too much of a variance from that target, that's it. That you're done with that movement for the day. So it's critical to use this facet as well. But the thing is, there is a big drawback when it comes to auto regulation. We all know that the general adaptive syndrome speaks about overreaching and how it is critical. It is critical for performance. You overreach an athlete and you supercompensate by getting maximal adaptations from it. Cal Leitch talks about how he sends his athletes home before Christmas on an absolutely fatigued state. And when they come back after the Christmas break, they're at the best performance shape as possible. So overreaching is critical at the end of the day if you want to see better adaptations. It's a matter of identifying variables and tuning variables to suit the needs which you need to. Sometimes you need to take risks, but take risks within the boundaries you can operate in. Because if you go beyond a boundary, then there is a good chance that you might break the athlete down and do more harm than good. So that is one drawback with auto regulation. It does not necessarily consider the concept of overreaching as such. So it's a little bit more preventative in nature, where you're trying to protect the athlete at the end of the day. Well, now the second concept I'm going to talk about is something which has been made up by Naren Jovanovic. So he talks about this concept of agile periodization, where before you understand this, you need to consider 3 different models. So you have your phenomenological model, you have your performance model, and your physiological model. So the phenomenological model, sorry for my pronunciation, it's just a tricky word to pronounce. So it's just basically observing phenomenon. So in the case of a sport, so you have a court sport athlete, say badminton, you observe the game, you observe the training sessions, you observe the practice sessions. Now that's a phenomenon happening there, right? So you observe it, you identify, okay, were they sluggish, were they moving well, what were they doing right, what were they not doing? So you use your vision, you use the coach's eye to observe it. You have the performance model, which you could consider the quantifiable metrics. Say from the phenomenon you observed, you also had some modalities through which you could collect data, say a GPS metric, or if you're in the training room, you have a bar speed, you could attach a push band or anything to show the acceleration of the bar. You can measure that. And you have your physiological model, which is basically your lab-based measurements. Anything which could be taken from your to understand how your body works when it comes to RBC measures, your mitochondrial density, your cardiovascular how your system works, how it's actually reacting to that stress which you're putting on it. Now, once you understand these three models, it's now it comes to the practice of actually applying it. So you have certain qualities. Say you have qualities of an athlete which you want to improve, but then again you have each qualities you want to improve. It's always going to be you're going to reach a stage where you're not able to push further. So you have your determinants, or they're called the rate limiters. Now you need to characterize certain interventions to move over these rate limiters so you can get the adaptive qualities you want for the athlete. And this is the fundamental way in which the whole concept of agile periodization works. So you identify qualities, you identify the rate limiters of qualities, you establish interventions in place to ensure that you are able to progress those qualities despite the determinants in its place. And it's you also need to identify three questions. So ask yourself three questions. One is what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and the most important one of all, how can one minimize the risk of being wrong? Because there's a very fine line of pushing the athlete to a level or breaking them down. So you need to find the fine line and ensure you are working within the boundaries to elicit maximal adaptations. uh, you could approach this in two ways. So you have a via positiva model and the via negativa model. So via positiva model, say for example, you have an athlete whose performance you want to improve. Now the two ways in which you could do it. One is you could improve their potential, you could improve their genetic, you could improve their potential through training. But we don't live in a perfect world. We have so many other components, as discussed earlier, which are going to come in place to prevent us from doing that, or it's just going to add up to excess stress, which is exactly something we're trying to combat. Now, that is not going to work in our world. But the via negativa model, on the contrary, poses a solution where instead of trying to improve, so you want to improve an athlete's performance. Now, instead of trying to improve his potential, you just try to maintain. So you microdose. So the via negativa model talks about microdosing, where you find the qualities you want to work with and you dose it in a micro manner so that you're getting the best benefit. You're still training them, you're still getting those adaptations. Now it look at it in these buckets. So for example, say you have certain traits, so these are all the qualities of the athlete you want to build, and you have these particular qualities. Say some of them might be applicable for some sports, some might not. So let's just say the first four here are speed, agility, power, strength, and say yeah, the fifth one, which is lockout. Now a lockout would be highly critical in the sport of weightlifting or powerlifting, because you need to lock the position out and hold it before you get the green light to actually drop the weight. But in the case of, say, soccer or badminton, that plays no impact here because you're not locking the bar out for the sport. So you identify the traits, the qualities which need to be addressed, and you discard the ones which you don't want. And now you have a specific time or resource set which you have. Whatever attributes and qualities need to be addressed, you fill those. You invest time and resources into those. So as you can see here, the four methods have been invested equally into. But there's going to be timelines where you realize that you need special attention. Say an athlete is drastically lacking in agility. He's just slow moving off his feet. So you're going to have to invest a little bit more time in that. So if any special attention is needed in any of those attributes, you apply time to that. So agile periodization basically takes into account all these factors. So the earlier factors that to be considered. So you have your stress taken care of, you have your individualization taken care of, you have your travel taken care of, as well as you have uncertainty taken care of. So it's basically working in an environment where there's so much risk coming your way, but you use all of these means to ensure that you minimize the risk, because you want the athlete to perform. You don't want to break them down. You cover all your bases. You whatever needs to be addressed, you address it. Yes, you want to follow an optimal path where you want to do so many things, but sometimes optimal doesn't work in the real world. So you need to try and be as robust as possible. You need to try to cover as much as ground as possible with what you have, and instead of trying to look for a perfect scenario where you could do something. and microdose. So we know that we can get, by microdosing, you could get all the adaptations by doing it on a day-to-day basis minus the fatigue. You could get an athlete to come in and say, for example, the smallest things of running a few sprints every day as part of his warm-up. That itself could be microdosing speed over a long period of time, where you could get the same physiological adaptations we want. And use a variety. There's a variety of means to do things the same way. So you want to work the same set of, say you want to work acceleration drills, you have so many things to do. You can just start, you can change your start position, you could have push-up start or a soft start or a hard start. There's so many things, so you can tweak around the variables, use different variety to ensure that athletes are not bored, because you don't want too little variety. You want variety enough to get them to actually be interested in coming to the session. So you get them to always want a little bit more at the end of the day. So you don't want to reveal everything where they be like, oh yeah, we're going to do this. But instead you want to be like, hey, okay, today's training session was good. I look forward to the next one. So you create that element of suspense in them. So you get them to come in excited, so they give it their best. And we as strength and conditioning coaches or sports scientists, we always look for quantifiable metrics. We want to test things. We want to isolate time to sit and test and understand, have we seen improvements or not. But we should also understand that by testing, you're also using valuable time, which could be gone towards training. So what agile periodization also takes into account is you integrate testing by embedding it into the training session. So you use these modalities. Say autoregulation is a great modality you could use to actually get to get the testing out of the way as well, because you are constantly monitoring it. You're not trying to allocate one day to monitor the athlete. You monitoring the athlete on a day-to-day basis, and that itself forms a framework of agile periodization, where you have a system in place, you use it, you learn from it, you take feedback from it, and you reapply it. So you use it in these set structures of 2 to 4 weeks, where you have a particular target, you have qualities, you address those qualities, then by observing your phenomenon and your physiological and your performance, you see what can be improved, you take feedback from it, and you repeat the same process, you implement it, and you repeat the same process again. Now, just want to end this presentation on a very powerful quote which I came across. What separates us from animals is the stressors we put on ourselves and their manifestations. And with that, I conclude this presentation. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. Any questions, you can direct them my way.
Robert Sapolsky, good way to finish a presentation.
Question, Rohan.
Questions. Okay. Good presentation, Nafi. I'm glad that you were able to explain agile periodization. I can commend you on that. That is not an easy topic to explain. I wanted to just talk about a couple of things. One, are you talking about the factors to consider, right? You're looking at individuality, stress, uncertainty, and travel, right? Can you maybe elaborate on how you would address each of these individually or all together? Auto-regulation is kind of all-encompassing, but are there some individual strategies, specific strategies you use to address kind of all of these 4 modalities?
Okay, so each of these would impact one physiologically and psychologically. So it is going to impart a certain amount of stress. So an ideal way in which these could be changed is one through nutrition, because obviously there's a huge component of individuality. 2 people could never take the same stress the same way. Or you have your stress as well, which could come from a lot of other variables which are out of your control, or uncertainty too, which works hand in hand with stress, and travel. Excuse me. So one thing which could be used to mitigate all these 4 could be nutrition, because nutrition plays a huge role in how one's body adapts to stress and how it's able to spring back to normal. Whereas if we look at training stimulus wise, the thing is, these are factors which usually aren't necessarily considered when planning a long-term procedure. So if you have, say, a year's plan put out in place, because most people work with an end objective in mind. Say I have an athlete competing at the end of the year, now I would start planning from now. But there's no way we could consider individuality to an extent and travel to an extent could be considered, because you know the schedule in advance. But stress and uncertainty are things which are very, very difficult to actually take into account, because you don't know which night the athlete's not going to sleep. You don't know when something might go wrong. So I think agile periodization actually, along with auto regulation, actually play a big role in helping people navigate through these cloudy waters of these four elements here. But then again, it would be on a very case-to-case basis.
Okay, I was maybe I asked the question wrong. I was looking at it more in terms of something like individuality. How do you test whether someone responds to strength training better or endurance training, right? Testing would be one of the ways. For example, if you have a full basketball team, some people may respond much better to endurance work. Some people may respond much better to strength work. And based on that, you can always look at who to look. Based on assessments, you can group people into buckets and specifically work on different aspects, right? So I'm just looking at it in terms of those kind of strategies. That kind of brings to light the importance of assessments.
Okay. Just give me 1 second. For some reason my laptop crashed and it's closed up everything.
Oh, okay.
I think, Rohan, that's a little bit off topic.
Sure. But it's looking at
in
a periodization model. In a periodization model, why it's important to keep consistently test, and then though you might make a plan over the whole year, based on the individuals, the way they respond to testing, you're going to modify and change the plan around.
So I mean, you could use the concept of agile there as well, right? Because you are embedding testing into it. You're not trying to keep individual days to test. You are constantly monitoring someone, and you review the plan as you go along with it. So you review, say, for example, you have an athlete who's responding really well. So you might actually load them up a little bit more, and you could take that factor into consideration by following the agile periodization concept.
Anybody with any other question?
A question.
Sure.
During the build phase, you don't stay there too long. I hope I understood it correctly. How long is too long? Like when you talk about this phase?
Are you talking with respect to the single competitive sport or the multi-competitive sport?
I think I was single competitive.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, so here ideally say the example here, because you are competing one major competition a year, you would stay on a build phase for a slightly longer period of time. I mean, this is just an example. You might necessarily not follow it this way. In this case, an athlete would be going through, say, 6 months of a build phase. But the other factor which needs to be considered is also that you repeating the same training modality is going to see a significant drop off in how you adapt to it. So it's critical. So your block periodization would be, say, for example, a conjugate system could also be used here, where you are training different facets and also keeping the novelty of the training stimulus as well applicable here. Because if you are using this phase for a slightly longer period of time, you are bound to be a little repetitive. I'm not saying completely repetitive, but there is going to be a chance where repetition might be a factor which has to be considered. So a conjugate system could also be used in the preparation phase to ensure that your stimulus is novel and you're not breaking down by doing too much volume as well. Did that answer your question, Manu?
Yeah. Thanks for that. Just wanted to say a really nice presentation also. Covered a lot and examples which I think we can all use to apply right away.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, so I'm going to take it as we're done. If anybody has any questions.